There is a question that serious archaeologists, geneticists, and historians argue about in quiet conference rooms and in papers with cautious footnotes. And the question is this: where did we go? Not where did we come from? Where did we go? Because here is the thing that should stop you cold the moment you really sit with it. Modern human beings, people with brains wired exactly like yours, with the full biological capacity for language and art and abstract reasoning and grief and love, have been walking this planet for at least 100,000 years. And for roughly 90,000 of those years, the story of what we did is almost entirely missing. 90,000 years. That is 9 times the entire span of recorded human history. 9 times every dynasty, every empire, every war, every invention, every name you have ever learned in school. 9 times all of that, and we have almost nothing. A handful of scratched bones, some ochre, a few shaped stones. Silence. Enormous, bewildering silence stretching back into a darkness so deep that even our best instruments can barely see the bottom of it. You probably know the beginning of the human story the way most people know it. You know about Egypt and Rome and Greece, about the Mesopotamian cities that rose between the Tigris and Euphrates, about the first writing pressed into clay, the first wheels, the first organized armies marching under the flags of the first kings. That story begins roughly 10,000 years ago, sometimes a little earlier, and it is a rich, complicated, well-documented story full of names and dates and causes and consequences. It is the story we call history, and it is by any reasonable measure extraordinary. But here is what nobody told you in school. That story is the last 10%. Everything you know, every civilization, every written word, every monument and map and empire, that is the last 10% of the time modern humans have been alive and thinking and making things and burying their dead and singing songs and asking questions they could not answer. The other 90%, the first 90,000 years, of the 100,000 years that modern Homo sapiens has spent on this earth, that is the part that has almost no record. That is the part we cannot explain. That is the part that keeps some of the most brilliant researchers in the world awake at night, turning over the few fragments of evidence we have and trying to make sense of a story that was told entirely in perishable materials, in wood and bone and breath and memory, and has mostly dissolved. Tonight, we are going to try to understand that silence. We are going to try to understand what it means that 90,000 years of fully modern human life left almost no trace. We are going to look at the fragments that did survive, the ochre handprints, the scratched geometric symbols, the carefully shaped blades, the deliberate burials, and try to hear what they are saying across all that darkness. And we are going to sit with the possibility, which gets more serious with every passing decade of research, that the story of those 90,000 years was not a story of primitive wanderers stumbling toward eventual civilization. That it was a story of people as fully human as you are, navigating a world of extraordinary difficulty and beauty, building lives and knowledge and relationships and meaning in the complete absence of any of the tools we assume are necessary for those things. And that almost all of it, almost every word of that story, is gone. This is, if you let yourself feel it, one of the great tragedies of human history. And also, strangely, one of the great mysteries. And mysteries told in the dark, in a quiet voice, are what the best sleep is made of. Let us begin with numbers, because the numbers are the first thing that breaks the standard story open and forces you to look at what you have been missing. Modern Homo sapiens, Anatomically modern humans with skeletons and skulls that would be unremarkable in any contemporary population appear in the fossil record at approximately 300,000 years ago in some interpretations, and at a minimum of 200,000 years ago in the most conservative readings of the evidence. For our purposes tonight, let us use the figure that most researchers accept as solidly documented and essentially uncontroversial. Modern humans have been present on Earth for at least 100,000 years. 100,000 years of Homo sapiens. 100,000 years of our species, in something very close to its current form, living and dying and leaving whatever traces it could in the sediment of time. Now hold that number next to this one. The earliest writing we have, the proto-cuneiform tablets from ancient Sumer in modern Iraq, dates to approximately 5,500 years ago. The earliest evidence of what we might confidently call civilization, of urban settlements with enough social complexity to generate written records, goes back perhaps 6,000 or 7,000 years. If we are generous, if we include the very earliest agricultural settlements and the first permanent villages, we might push the beginning of recorded and archaeologically rich human cultural history back to 12,000 or 13,000 years. 12,000 years versus 100,000. The gap is 88,000 years. That is 88,000 years of modern human life for which the record is sparse at best, fragmentary everywhere, and almost entirely silent about the things that matter most: what people believed, what they said to each other, what stories they told, how they organized their communities, what they understood about the world, what they feared, what they loved, and why they got up in the morning and kept going in conditions that would, by any modern standard of survival, be described as extraordinarily harsh. This is the arithmetic of absence, and the absence is not random. It is not equally distributed across all categories of evidence. The things that survive from deep time are things made of stone, things preserved in extraordinary conditions of cold or aridity, things that happen to have been buried in the right kind of sediment at the right depth in the right location to resist the chemistry of dissolution. What does not survive is almost everything else. Wood rots within decades. Leather dissolves within centuries. Plant fiber becomes invisible in most soils within decades, let alone millennia. Paintings on organic surfaces, bark or skin or woven material, vanish without a trace. Songs leave no trace at all, not even a molecule's. Stories told around fires disappear with the last breath of the last person who knew them. The people of the first 90,000 years built their lives mostly from organic materials. And in most environments, organic materials disappear with a completeness that is absolute. This creates a catastrophic selection effect in the archaeological record, one that is not just quantitatively severe, but qualitatively distorting. Because the organic materials that vanished were not the least important things those people made. They were, in many cases, the most important. The tools made of stone that survive are the equivalent of us being remembered only by our power drills and kitchen knives, while everything we wrote, everything we painted, everything we sang, every building we inhabited, every relationship we formed, every belief we held, every story we passed to our children, dissolved without trace. You would learn something about us from the power drills and the kitchen knives, but you would miss everything that made our lives worth living, and you might be forgiven for concluding, incorrectly but understandably, that we were primitive. This is the trap that the arithmetic of absence sets for us. When we look at the first 90,000 years and see mostly simple stone tools and very occasional evidence of ochre use and very rare burials with very sparse goods, the temptation is to conclude that the lives of those people were accordingly simple. that the emptiness of the record reflects an emptiness in the experience. That because we find almost nothing was there. But this conclusion, which almost every popular account of prehistory at least implicitly endorses, does not follow from the evidence. The evidence is absent. The lives were not. Before we go any further into the silence of those 90,000 years, we need to settle something fundamental, something that the way we usually talk about prehistory tends to obscure or paper over. We need to settle who those people were, because the answer to that question changes everything about how we should understand their absence from the record. And the answer is not what most people assume when they imagine a person living 100,000 years ago. The people who lived in the first 100,000 years of modern human history were not proto-humans. They were not rough drafts of the real thing. They were not beings of limited intelligence slowly inching their way toward the cognitive complexity that would eventually, tens of thousands of years later, produce art and language and civilization. They were, in the precise technical sense, us, anatomically modern, neurologically modern, cognitively modern. The same brain with the same capacity sitting inside a skull that would be unremarkable in any contemporary city on Earth. The human brain achieved its current size and organization somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. The specific neural architecture that supports language, the regions devoted to syntax and semantics, and the production and comprehension of complex speech, was already present. The structures that support long-range planning, the ability to imagine future states and work backward from them to present actions, were already present. The capacity for symbolic thought, for the representation of one thing by another, for the kind of meaning-making that generates art and religion and mathematics, was already present. The capacity for grief and love and fear and wonder, and the specific human ache of looking at the night sky and feeling that it means something you cannot quite articulate. All of that was fully present in every person who lived in those first 100,000 years. When you imagine a person living 100,000 years ago, do not imagine a creature on the edge of humanity, still partly animal, still mostly driven by instinct, still limited by a brain that had not yet fully wired itself for thought. Imagine instead a person of identical intelligence sitting across a table from you right now. Someone who, given the same information environment you grew up in, the same exposure to written language and schools and accumulated cultural knowledge, would be indistinguishable from anyone you know. Someone who might have been a brilliant mathematician or a gifted storyteller or a subtle and perceptive reader of other people's emotions or a deeply original thinker about the nature of the world. Someone whose capacity for humor and irony and the appreciation of beauty and the particular pleasure of a well-told story was exactly as developed as yours, no more limited and no less capable. The difference between that person and you is not capacity. It is accumulated information. They did not have access to the 10,000 years of written records that you inherited as your birthright, simply by being born into this era. They did not have the benefit of every previous generation's discoveries being written down and preserved and transmitted forward in ways that made the knowledge of their grandparents and great-grandparents as accessible as the knowledge of their parents. The library available to them was the library of their community, maintained entirely in living memory and transmitted entirely through speech and demonstration and practice. It was a library of great depth, of accumulated ecological and social and practical knowledge refined over generations. But it had no physical form, no permanence beyond the life of the people who held it, and could be catastrophically disrupted by the death of elders, by the separation of groups, by the ordinary catastrophes of a world without medicine or agriculture, or the safety nets of complex civilization. This is the person whose story we have almost entirely lost. Not a primitive stumbling through the dark ages of human prehistory. A person. A full, complicated, brilliant, frightened, loving, creative, spiritual, social, laughing, grieving person whose interior life was as rich as yours, whose questions about the world were as genuine as yours, whose love for their children was as fierce as any love you have ever felt or witnessed, and whose story, told entirely in organic materials in the open air over 90,000 years, has almost entirely dissolved into the soil and the air and the silence. The fragments that did survive from those 90,000 years of human life are small in number and often ambiguous in their meaning, but they are not nothing. Each one is a message in a bottle from an almost unimaginable distance, a physical object that has crossed the ocean of time to land on our shore and demand to be read with the full weight of attention it deserves. And what they say, taken together and read carefully and without the bias toward primitive interpretations that has distorted the field for so long, is something very different from the story of cognitive simplicity that the silence might otherwise suggest. Consider the ochre. Ochre is iron oxide, a mineral pigment ranging in color from yellow to deep red, and it shows up in the archaeological record in association with modern humans and their immediate predecessors in ways that have been attracting increasing and increasingly serious attention. At sites in South Africa, ochre has been found in quantities that suggest systematic collection and use going back more than 100,000 years, in some cases, considerably more. At Pinnacle Point on the South African coast, ochre use has been dated to at least 160,000 years ago. At Blombos Cave, also in South Africa, pieces of ochre have been found engraved with geometric patterns and dated to approximately 100,000 years ago, and an apparent ochre processing workshop with grinding stones and shells used as mixing containers has been dated to about 77,000 years ago. Ochre is not a food. It is not a tool in the conventional sense. It does not make hunting easier or shelter warmer or water cleaner, or any of the things that a purely utilitarian interpretation of prehistoric behavior would expect it to do. Ochre is a pigment, and pigments are used to color things, and coloring things is a behavior that implies symbolic thought. You color something because you want it to look different from how it looks in its natural state, and you want it to look different because the difference means something, because appearance carries significance, because you inhabit a world in which the visible properties of things communicate information about categories and relationships and identities and intentions and beliefs. Ochre use implies a world suffused with symbolic meaning, a world in which the color of your skin or your tools or the objects in your shelter says something about you, carries a message, performs a social or spiritual or aesthetic function. A world, in short, of culture. Rich, developed, meaning-saturated culture. The geometric engravings on ochre from Blombos Cave are even more striking. Small pieces of iron-rich stone have been found there scratched with careful, repetitive geometric patterns that could not have resulted from random or functional use. The patterns are deliberate designs imposed on the material with evident intention and evident skill, cross-hatched and parallel-lined in ways that suggest not random scratching, but the expression of a formal visual vocabulary. Geometric patterns require the ability to conceive of and reproduce abstract forms, to impose regularity on a medium, to produce something that represents not a specific object in the world, but a formal relationship between shapes. This is mathematical thinking. This is the same cognitive operation that underlies every decorative tradition in human history. Every geometric design on every piece of pottery, and every textile and every carved surface and every architectural ornament ever made by human beings, anywhere. It is the same cognitive operation that underlies music, which is at its heart the imposition of formal pattern on sound in time. The people who scratched those patterns into ochre 90,000 years ago were not operating at the edge of human cognitive capacity. They were thinking in exactly the way that all subsequent human art and mathematics continues to think, in the way that you think when you find a visual pattern satisfying or a piece of music beautiful. Or consider the shell beads. At Blombos Cave and at other sites scattered across North Africa and the Middle East, small shells have been found that were clearly not food remains but were collected, perforated and strung to be worn as ornaments. The shells are selected for their specific aesthetic properties, their small size, their regular shape, their particular color, their suitability for suspension on a cord. They were perforated deliberately with tools, and the perforations show wear patterns consistent with suspension and movement, the wear of a bead that has been hanging against other beads and against skin for extended periods. Some are dated to more than 100,000 years ago, and the geographic spread of similar finds across North Africa and the Levant suggests not an isolated local anomaly, but a widespread and apparently persistent practice of personal ornamentation. Personal ornaments. Think for a moment about what personal ornaments actually are and what their existence implies. They are objects worn on the body to communicate something about the wearer, to mark membership in a group or a status within a group, or an affiliation with particular beliefs, or an individual identity that can be read and decoded by other members of the community. You cannot wear a necklace without participating in a system of shared symbolic meaning, without both encoding a message and expecting to be decoded by other people who understand what the ornament signifies. Personal ornaments are evidence of social complexity, of communities structured and organized enough that personal identity needed to be marked and communicated across the interactions of daily life, of a symbolic vocabulary shared among people who understood what particular objects worn in particular ways and in particular combinations meant. To understand the first 100,000 years of human life, you have to understand the world those people were navigating, not as a set of abstract geological facts, but as a lived environment with specific dangers and specific beauties, and specific challenges that shaped every decision those people made about how to live. The world of the first 100,000 years was not the world we inhabit, and the differences are not merely matters of degree. They are differences that shaped everything about what was possible, what was required, and what the specific content of human knowledge and human fear needed to be. The climate during most of the first 100,000 years of Homo sapiens was colder and more variable than it is today. Ice sheets extended deep into what are now temperate regions. Sea levels were dramatically lower than current levels because enormous volumes of water were locked in continental ice sheets, sometimes kilometers thick. Rainfall patterns across Africa and Asia were radically different from the patterns that gave rise to agriculture and civilization. The African continent, where modern humans originated and where they lived for most of the first 100,000 years of their existence, was not uniformly habitable. It went through dramatic cycles of expansion and contraction in habitable area, with periods of relative moisture and abundance followed by periods of severe aridity, when entire regions that had supported significant populations became effectively uninhabitable desert, fragmenting human populations into isolated refugia, separated by hundreds of kilometers of hostile terrain. One such period of extreme aridity occurring approximately 120,000 years ago and lasting for tens of thousands of years in some regions, may have reduced the effective population of our species to a few thousand individuals clustered in isolated coastal and riverine refugia. If you have ever wondered why humans have so little genetic diversity compared to other great apes, despite being the most geographically widespread primate on Earth, and despite having been a successful and adaptable species for a very long time, this is part of the answer. Our species came very close, at least once and possibly several times in the first 100,000 years, to not making it at all. The first 100,000 years were not years of steady, peaceful population growth into a welcoming landscape. They were years of boom and bust, expansion and near extinction, population growth in favorable periods and catastrophic collapse in unfavorable ones, with all the cultural disruption and knowledge loss that repeated demographic crashes inevitably entail. The large animals of the Pleistocene were a constant reality in the world those people inhabited, and that reality cut in both directions. On the one hand, the megafauna of the Pleistocene offered extraordinary food resources. The woolly mammoth, the giant buffalo, the various species of elephant and rhinoceros and hippopotamus that populated the African and later Eurasian landscapes, these were living larders of enormous caloric density. A single successful hunt could feed a community for days or weeks. But on the other hand, those same animals represented immediate, life-ending physical danger of a kind that most people in modern industrialized societies have no lived experience of. Cave lions larger than any lion alive today. Leopards and spotted hyenas capable of taking adult humans. Short-faced bears of terrifying size and speed. The world of the first 100,000 years was a world in which the line between hunter and hunted was not fixed and not always clearly on the human side, and the vigilance required to survive in it was not the vigilance of someone who might occasionally encounter a dangerous situation. It was the continuous, unrelenting vigilance of someone embedded in a food web that included real, frequent, potentially immediate threats of violent death from multiple directions. This background of physical danger shaped the psychology of those people in ways that are still fully detectable in us, thousands of years after the immediate threats that calibrated those responses are gone. The startle response, the instinctive fear of certain sounds in the dark, the way that unexpected movement in peripheral vision arrests all thought and all attention and focuses everything on the potential threat. The specific quality of alertness that darkness produces, the way a certain kind of quiet in the night can produce a state of readiness that bypasses all conscious reasoning and goes straight to the body. These responses are not arbitrary. They were tuned by tens of thousands of years of predator-prey relationships in environments where the cost of relaxing vigilance at the wrong moment was death, and they are as fully present in you as they were in the people who first developed them, living in a world that genuinely required them every single day. Somewhere in the first 100,000 years of human life, something extraordinary happened that would ultimately shape the entire subsequent history of our species and set in motion a process whose full consequences took tens of thousands of years to unfold. It did not produce a monument or a written record, or even, in most cases, an artifact sophisticated enough to survive and be identified tens of thousands of years later in any definitive way. But it was, by any reasonable measure of human achievement, one of the most dramatic things any species has ever done. Modern humans left Africa and began to spread across the planet. This did not happen all at once, and it was not a planned expedition. Nobody sat down and decided to colonize the world. It was the result of thousands of individual decisions made by thousands of small groups over tens of thousands of years. To follow game into new territory, to move toward better water sources, to escape competition or conflict with neighboring groups, to simply explore what lay beyond the known horizon in the way that curious, intelligent beings do when they have the capacity for curiosity and the means of movement. The cumulative result of all those individual decisions, playing out over generations too many to count, was that a species that originated in sub-Saharan Africa ended up on every habitable continent within approximately 80,000 years of beginning to move. The first major dispersal out of Africa appears to have occurred approximately 60 to 70,000 years ago, though there is evidence of earlier movements going back further, some of which appear to have involved populations that did not ultimately persist in the areas they reached and left no detectable genetic legacy in living populations. The dispersal that gave rise to all non-African populations alive today moved out through the Horn of Africa or through the Sinai Peninsula into the Arabian Peninsula and then along the southern coast of Asia, following the coastline east through what is now southern India and Sri Lanka, and eventually into Southeast Asia and beyond. From Southeast Asia, the expansion continued north into Central Asia and east into the Pacific, and eventually, through separate movements at different times, into Europe and the Americas. The colonization of Australia was the most audacious step of the entire expansion, and the one that most clearly demonstrates the cognitive and technological sophistication of the people involved. Even at the glacial maximum when sea levels were at their lowest point, when the vast subcontinent of Sundaland, now submerged beneath the South China Sea and the Java Sea, connected what are now the large islands of Southeast Asia to the Asian mainland and dramatically shortened the water crossings required to move eastward, there was still a minimum ocean crossing of at least 60 to 70 kilometers of open water that stood between the furthest eastern land and the first shore of what would become Australia. There was no land visible on the horizon. There was nothing to sail toward except the possibility, based on whatever observations suggested its existence, that something was out there. The people who made that crossing were deliberate navigators who chose to commit to an ocean voyage with no visible destination, carrying enough people to found a viable founding population in whatever they found on the other side. In vessels capable of surviving days at sea in waters that could be rough and unpredictable. This required engineering. It required planning across a time horizon of days or weeks. It required navigational skill capable of maintaining direction in the absence of landmarks. And it required a quality of courage and conviction that is genuinely difficult to overstate from the comfortable distance of our present. The first people who landed in Australia 50,000 years ago, stepping off whatever vessel had carried them onto a shore that no human being had ever stood on before, stepping into a continent full of animals that had never learned to fear humans, and a landscape whose resources they did not yet know were doing something extraordinary, something brave, something that deserves more recognition than it usually receives. For most of the first 100,000 years of human life on Earth, modern Homo sapiens was not the only kind of human being walking the planet. This fact is one that the standard story of human history tends to treat as a footnote, a brief mention of Neanderthals, before moving on to the real story, which is assumed to be entirely about us. But the other humans who shared the world with our ancestors during those first 100,000 years were real people, real beings with real inner lives, real cultures, real knowledge, and their encounters with our ancestors left consequences that are literally embodied in the people alive today. Their story is part of our story in ways that go all the way down to the molecular level. Neanderthals are the most familiar and the most consistently misrepresented. The popular image of the Neanderthal as a stooped, brutish cave dweller with minimal intelligence and limited awareness barely survives contact with what the evidence actually shows. Neanderthals had brains that were, on average, larger than ours, organized differently but not simpler or less capable in any straightforward sense. They made tools of considerable sophistication using techniques that required planning and prediction and an understanding of how specific stones would fracture under controlled percussion. They controlled fire, cooked food, and used fire to process the adhesives used to haft their stone tools to handles, a multi-step process requiring an understanding of materials chemistry that is genuinely impressive. They hunted large, dangerous prey, including woolly rhinoceroses and cave bears, hunting that required coordinated group effort and communication sophisticated enough to plan and execute complex strategies. They cared for their injured and their elderly, as evidenced by individuals in the fossil record who survived serious injuries and debilitating diseases that would have required sustained social support to recover from or live with. And they made art. Eagle talon jewelry, perforated and worn as personal ornaments, has been found at Neanderthal sites in Croatia and Spain. Pigment use with both ochre and manganese dioxide has been documented at numerous Neanderthal sites in patterns suggesting body decoration. Some cave art in Spain has been dated to more than 65,000 years ago, before any modern human had yet arrived in Europe, implying that at least some of the cave art tradition that we tend to attribute to modern humans may have been initiated by Neanderthals, who were already practicing symbolic visual expression before our ancestors arrived on the same continent. These were not primitive beings. These were people who had been living successfully in European environments for hundreds of thousands of years, who had developed sophisticated cultural traditions adapted to those specific environments, and who were capable of symbolic behavior and aesthetic expression in ways that placed them firmly within the range of what we call human. The genetic record of what happened when our ancestors met the Neanderthals is unambiguous and remarkable. Modern humans outside of sub-Saharan Africa carry between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. This is not a contamination artifact or a methodological error. It is the direct biological record of real interbreeding events, of encounters between modern humans and Neanderthals, that produced children who survived and reproduced, and whose descendants are the people reading or hearing this tonight. If you are of non-African ancestry, you carry Neanderthal DNA in your cells right now. It is not inert, not a vestige with no current function. It influences your immune system in ways that have been specifically identified. It may influence aspects of your neurology. It is a living inheritance from a meeting that happened in the silence of the first 100,000 years, between beings different enough to be called separate species, but similar enough to produce viable and fertile offspring. That is a remarkable thing. That is something that deserves more than a footnote. What happened to the Neanderthals in the end is a question whose answer involves a degree of discomfort that is worth sitting with. Within a few thousand years of sustained contact. Disclaimer. This video contains fictional and / or AI-assisted elements created for artistic and entertainment purposes. It does not aim to mislead viewers or present real-world events as factual documentation. Contact with expanding modern human populations in Europe, after 300,000 years of successful occupation of that territory through multiple glacial cycles, the Neanderthals were gone. The specific mechanism is debated, and the debate is in some ways more comfortable than the certainty would be. Competitive exclusion from key resources, disease transmission, direct violent conflict, climate change that modern humans adapted to better than Neanderthals, or some combination of all of these. Whatever the mechanism, a people who had occupied Europe for 300,000 years, who had survived repeated glacial maxima that must have been desperately hard, who had built sophisticated cultural traditions, and who were apparently capable of symbolic thought and expression, were gone within a geological instant of meeting us. The meeting in the darkness of the first 100,000 years was not, for the Neanderthals, a fortunate one. The first 100,000 years of human life were not continuous or smooth. They were punctuated by catastrophes of a severity that is difficult to fully appreciate from our current position of relative climatic stability. Catastrophes that repeatedly reduced human populations, disrupted cultural continuity, and erased knowledge that had been accumulated over generations, creating the gaps and discontinuities in the archaeological record that contribute so much to our difficulty in understanding those years. The most dramatic of these catastrophes, the one whose impact on human populations may have been the most severe, occurred approximately 74,000 years ago. In what is now northern Sumatra in Indonesia, a supervolcanic eruption of almost incomprehensible scale released an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. The eruption of the Toba supervolcano was one of the largest volcanic events in at least the last 2 million years, and probably much longer. The ash from the eruption spread across the Indian subcontinent in a layer still detectable today as a distinct geological horizon sometimes meters thick. The sulfur dioxide released into the stratosphere created aerosols that scattered incoming solar radiation for years, producing a volcanic winter that dramatically reduced global temperatures and triggered a prolonged period of climatic deterioration that may have lasted for 1,000 years or more. The genetic evidence for the impact of Toba on human populations is striking and has been the subject of extensive research and debate. Modern humans show significantly less genetic diversity than would be expected for a species of our age and our geographic spread, a pattern consistent with the kind of severe population bottleneck that follows a dramatic reduction in population size. The timing of the bottleneck that best fits the genetic data coincides roughly with the Toba eruption and its aftermath. Some researchers have argued that the global human population was reduced to perhaps 10,000 individuals or fewer in the centuries following the eruption. A population small enough that the maintenance of complex cultural traditions would have been extremely difficult, and the loss of specific bodies of knowledge catastrophic. Entire ways of making tools, entire systems of ecological knowledge, entire symbolic traditions could have been lost simply because the specific communities that held them did not survive. Whether or not the most extreme version of the Toba bottleneck hypothesis is correct, the general pattern it represents is almost certainly real as a feature of the first 100,000 years. Populations contracted. Knowledge was lost. Cultural traditions that had been developing over generations were disrupted by the deaths of the elders who held them, by the dispersal of communities, by the desperate focus on immediate survival that leaves no space for the maintenance of more abstract aspects of culture. The behavioral modernity we can detect in the archaeological record of the first 100,000 years appears not as a steady accumulation building towards something, but as an episodic, fragmented, repeatedly interrupted development, with periods of genuine complexity and symbolic sophistication, followed by apparent regressions that may represent not actual cognitive decline, but the loss of specific cultural traditions in the wake of population crashes and demographic instability. This is one of the most important things to understand about the silence of the first 100,000 years. The silence is not uniform. In it, there are moments of light, glimpses of complexity and creativity that suggest something remarkable was present before the darkness closed again. The ochre engravings of Blombos Cave, and then apparent silence in the record from that region for thousands of years, the shell beads of North Africa, and then a gap, the sophisticated coastal exploitation at Pinnacle Point, and then the record goes quiet. These are not the traces of a gradually developing but consistently present culture. They are the traces of a culture that was repeatedly built up and repeatedly disrupted, that achieved sophistication more than once and lost it more than once, that was trying to persist in the face of conditions that made persistence extraordinarily difficult. The silence of the record is the silence of a people who kept almost making it, who kept building towards something that the specific difficulties of their world kept preventing them from fully reaching. Of all the things that dissolved in the first 100,000 years of human life, of all the irreplaceable inheritances of those years that were held in perishable materials and perishable minds, and could not survive the weight of time, the thing whose loss I find most devastating is the languages. Not language as a capacity which is fully present in every human being alive today, and appears to be a feature of our species going back at least as far as our anatomical modernity. The specific languages, the individual, irreplaceable, particular languages that were spoken and thought in and dreamed in and argued in and sung in and prayed in, and used to say goodbye across those 90,000 years of human life. Every single one of them gone with a completeness that is absolute. No language spoken today is more than about 12 to 15,000 years old in any form we can reconstruct through comparative linguistics. The family trees of languages, the relationships between languages that allow us to infer common ancestral forms, can be traced back, perhaps 15 to 20,000 years, with any confidence, and even those reconstructions become increasingly speculative, the further back you push them, as the rate of linguistic change over time outpaces our ability to detect common origins in surviving vocabulary and grammar. Beyond 20,000 years, the signal of shared ancestry dissolves entirely into noise. The languages of 100,000 years ago, the languages in which the first anatomically modern humans thought their thoughts and told their stories, are completely and permanently inaccessible to us. We cannot reconstruct them. We cannot even determine how many there were, or how different they were from each other, or whether they had features of grammar, or sound or meaning that are completely absent from all surviving language families. And yet, those languages were real, and they were not simple. The cognitive capacity for complex language was fully present in the people who spoke them, the same capacity that generates the full complexity of any language alive today. Those languages had grammars with all the intricate rule systems that grammars entail. They had vocabularies of thousands of words, encoding distinctions about the world that those communities needed to make and that their environments made relevant. They had registers and styles and the specific quality of language that changes between intimate conversation and public ceremony, between the language you use with children and the language you use with elders, between the words you say when you are angry and the words you say when you are afraid and the words you say when you are moved by something beautiful in ways you cannot explain. The specific content of those languages, what was possible to say in them, what distinctions they made that no surviving language makes, what categories they organize the world into, that all surviving languages have abandoned. This is knowledge we will never have. We know that different languages do not simply translate word for word, that the structure of a language shapes the cognitive habits of its speakers in ways that are subtle and real, that some things are easy to think in some languages and difficult or impossible to think in others. The 90,000 years of linguistic diversity that we have lost was not 90,000 years of variations on the same cognitive theme. It was 90,000 years of different ways of being in the world, different architectures of thought, different relationships between the mind and the world it tries to understand. And all of it is gone, as completely as the songs, which left no trace whatsoever, not even a single word. There are things we can say about the first 100,000 years of human life with considerable confidence, not because we have direct and specific evidence from that period, but because they are features of human life so universal and so deeply rooted in our biology that their absence would require a specific explanation that is nowhere available. These are the features that were present in the first 100,000 years, not because we have found them in the archaeological record, but because they are foundational to what it is to be human, present in every documented human population, and grounded in biological structures old enough to be shared with species that diverged from our lineage millions of years ago. Fire is the first and most ancient of these certainties. The controlled use of fire goes back in the hominin lineage at least 400,000 years, and the evidence for fire use by earlier hominins extends back 1,000,000 years, and possibly further. By the time modern Homo sapiens existed, the use of fire was so deeply integrated into human life that it is essentially impossible to conceive of human existence without it. Fire for warmth, for cooking food to improve its digestibility and safety, for light in the darkness, for the protection against nocturnal predators that a maintained fire provides, for the processing of materials that benefit from heat. But perhaps most significantly for understanding the texture of life in the first 100,000 years, fire for gathering. For creating the space and the occasion and the light in which people come together at the end of the day and talk. A fire in the night creates a specific kind of space, a bounded circle of warmth and light surrounded by darkness. And in that circle, people gather. They have been gathering there around fires for longer than our species has existed in its current form. The gathering at the fire is perhaps the oldest social institution in the entire hominin lineage, and it created the conditions for everything that makes us most distinctively human. Sustained face-to-face social interaction across extended periods of time, the telling of stories in a setting where both teller and listeners are fully present to each other, the transmission of knowledge through speech and demonstration with the full attention of both parties, the negotiation of relationships and roles, and the management of the social tensions that arise when many people with many different needs and many different personalities live in close proximity to each other. The firelit circle was the original classroom and the original parliament and the original theatre all at once. It was where the first 100,000 years of human culture was made and argued over and transmitted and revised and made again, night after night, in communities spread across the African savanna and then across the world. Around those fires, families. The structure of the human family. The prolonged parental investment in offspring that is unusual among primates, the pair bonding that creates sustained cooperative relationships between the parents of children, the grandparenting that extends care and knowledge transmission beyond the immediate parent generation. These are not recent cultural inventions that emerged with civilization. They are biological features of our species, encoded in hormonal systems and neural responses to attachment and separation and loss, features that evolved over millions of years and were fully present in the people of the first 100,000 years. Those people loved their children in the specific, embodied, sometimes terrifying way that parents love children, the love that makes the vulnerability of a child feel like a physical threat to yourself, the love that changes the shape of fear by adding a new category of thing to be afraid of losing. Their children loved them back, with the full weight of the attachment system that makes the presence of a parent feel like safety, and the absence of a parent feel like danger. The grief of losing a child, or a parent, or a companion of many years, was real and specific and devastating in the way that grief always is when it falls on people capable of love. And around those fires, in those families, at the center of those communities, knowledge. Not the passive accumulation of facts, but the active, living, constantly revised body of understanding required to survive and to live well in a specific landscape at a specific time. The knowledge of where water would be in the dry season when the surface sources were gone. The knowledge of which of the hundreds of plant species in the territory were edible at which stages of growth in which seasons, and which were medicinal and which were toxic, and whether any of the toxic ones could be rendered safe by specific preparation methods. The knowledge of animal behavior, specific to the specific animals of the specific region, that made the difference between a successful hunt and an unsuccessful one, between a safe approach and a dangerous one. All of this knowledge was held in memory and transmitted through speech and demonstrated in practice, and it was being developed and refined and passed forward across every night of the first 100,000 years. Among all the things that survived from the first 100,000 years of human life, among all the fragments that made it through the long dissolution of time and materiality to reach us and demand to be read, the evidence of burial and of ritual treatment of the dead is the most affecting and the most philosophically significant. It is the evidence that most clearly and most directly says something to us across the distance of 100,000 years that we cannot pretend not to hear. These were people, not proto-humans, not cognitive forerunners of real humanity. People with all the weight and all the implications that word carries. The deliberate burial of the dead serves no obvious, immediate, practical purpose. A body that is buried is not more safely disposed of than a body left where it fell, not from the perspective of any pure utility calculus of survival behavior. Burial requires effort and time, requires that the living take energy away from the immediate demands of survival to perform a task that has no survival value in any direct material sense. There is only one reason to bury the dead carefully, to position the body deliberately, to include with it objects that were valuable in life, to mark the site in ways that preserve its identity as the resting place of a specific person, because the dead person had a significance that did not end with their death. Because the relationship between the living and the dead continued, in some form recognized and honored by the community. Because death was understood as something that required ritual acknowledgement, not merely biological management. The earliest evidence of deliberate burial in modern humans goes back at least 90 to 100,000 years, to sites in the Levant, including Skull Cave and Kafse in what is now Israel. At Kafse, more than 10 individuals, including children, were found in positions and contexts suggesting deliberate interment, some associated with red ochre and animal bones that appear to have been grave goods rather than food debris. At Skull, a burial included the jaws of a wild boar held in the arms of the deceased, an association too specific and too improbable to be accidental, an object placed with intention for reasons we cannot recover, but that we recognize as the behavior of people who believed that the dead would need something, or that the living owed the dead something, beyond the mere cessation of biological process. These burials are 100,000 years old. They are telling us something that is both simple and vast. They are telling us that the people of the first 100,000 years had a relationship to death that was not the relationship of one organism to the biological cessation of another. They had beliefs, or at least behaviors that imply beliefs, about what death was and what it required. The specific content of those beliefs we cannot recover. We do not know whether they believed in an afterlife or in the continuing presence of the dead among the living in some spiritual form, or in reincarnation, or in some other framework for understanding the nature of human existence and its relationship to mortality. We know only that they believed something, acted on it consistently, and that the actions required to express those beliefs in the physical world cost them effort and resources they could have used elsewhere. This is the beginning of religion, or rather, it is evidence that the beginning of religion predates what we usually recognize as the beginning of anything, that the relationship to the non-material dimension of existence, to the aspects of life that lie beyond the immediately practical and physical, is not a late addition to the human repertoire, but one of its oldest and most persistent features. The people who buried their dead with ochre and wild boar jaws 100,000 years ago were not primitive beings who had not yet discovered the spiritual dimension of existence. They were already living in it, as fully and as seriously as any person who has lived since. One of the most profound implications of the 90,000 years of silence is the knowledge that was held in those years and lost with them. Not knowledge in the abstract sense, not the mere accumulation of facts, but living, functional, tested knowledge about the world, developed over generations of careful observation and empirical refinement and encoded in cultural traditions that have not survived. Knowledge whose depth and sophistication we can only partly estimate from the glimpses we get in the surviving indigenous traditions that maintained something of the connection to that older way of knowing. Consider what a hunter-gatherer community occupying a particular territory for multiple generations accumulates in the way of ecological understanding. Every fruiting and flowering plant in the territory, its timing, its habitat preferences, its specific properties. Every animal species, its behavior, its seasonal movements, its vulnerabilities to specific hunting strategies, its specific dangers. Every water source, its reliability across seasons, the geological features that indicate its presence when it is not visible from the surface. The medicinal properties of dozens or hundreds of plant and animal and mineral substances developed through generations of systematic trial and observation in the context of real illness and real pain, tested against the ultimate test of whether the person got better or worse, refined by the feedback of outcomes across many cases over many years. This knowledge is not simple. It is not the kind of thing a person can acquire in a lifetime of casual observation. It is the product of generations of systematic attention, maintained by communities that understood its value and transmitted it with care. We know from ethnobotanists working with indigenous communities that survived into the modern era that traditional plant medicines frequently contain genuine pharmacological activity, that the empirical knowledge systems of traditional healers have repeatedly yielded compounds of real therapeutic significance that Western medicine spent decades or centuries discovering independently through formal research. The bark of the willow tree, used by indigenous peoples in multiple parts of the world to treat pain and fever, contains salicylic acid, the active compound in aspirin. Quinine, the first effective antimalarial drug, was derived from cinchona bark, which indigenous peoples of the Andes had been using to treat fever-related illness for centuries before European contact. The list extends far beyond these famous cases. What this tells us about the first 100,000 years is that the knowledge systems those people were developing across those years were of real depth and real consequence, and that their loss is not merely the loss of interesting historical information, but a real impoverishment of human understanding of the natural world. The ethnobotanical knowledge that has survived is only the fraction that persisted into the post-contact era, that was documented before cultural disruption erased it, and that has so far been investigated by formal researchers. the knowledge of the first 100,000 years, developed across many more generations in many more diverse environments, was almost certainly deeper and more comprehensive than what has survived. And essentially, all of it is gone. Every human culture we have ever documented, without exception, has ritual, has ceremony, has structured, collective, symbolic behavior performed at the significant transitions of life and the significant transitions of the year, and in response to the significant crises of existence. This is not a feature of some human cultures in some periods and not others. It is a universal, as consistent across the documented range of human diversity as language itself, as consistent as the use of fire, as consistent as the care of children. And because it is universal, because the neural systems that generate and respond to ritual behavior are present in every human being ever studied and appear to be ancient features of our biological inheritance, we can be confident that ritual was present in the first 100,000 years, even in the near-total absence of direct physical evidence for it. What ceremony does in human communities is something that no other form of social behavior quite replicates. It creates synchronized collective states. When many people perform the same movements, the same sounds, the same sequences of action in a shared space with a shared intention, something happens physiologically and psychologically that is genuinely different from the effects of any other kind of social activity. Heart rates synchronize. Breathing synchronizes. The neurochemistry of social bonding is activated in patterns and at scales that ordinary interaction does not produce. The subjective sense of being part of something larger than the individual self, of being embedded in a community that is real and present and significant, is produced with a reliability and an intensity that ritual has no peer in achieving. This is not trivial. In communities where the safety net is the community, where survival in difficult times depends on the willingness of others to share food and water and shelter and labor when you need it, the maintenance of social bonds is not a luxury but a survival requirement. And ritual is one of the primary technologies for maintaining those bonds, for renewing the sense of collective identity and mutual commitment that makes cooperation possible. The ceremonies of the first 100,000 years were not entertainment and were not mere superstition. They were functional social technology, maintaining the cohesion of communities that depended on cohesion to survive. The evidence for ceremony in the first 100,000 years is fragmentary but real. The deliberate burials with their ochre and their specific positioning of bodies. The collection and systematic processing of pigments in quantities that suggest not merely functional use, but ritualized application. The return to specific sites over generations in ways that suggest those sites held special significance, a significance not explained by their practical properties. The shell beads worn as markers of identity and affiliation, requiring a shared symbolic vocabulary to function as markers at all. Each of these fragments points toward a world of ceremony, of shared symbolic meaning, of structured collective behavior, organized around beliefs about what the world was and what human life meant within it. A world of culture, in the full sense of that word, 90,000 years before anyone thought to write any of it down. There is a bone flute in a museum case in Tübingen, Germany. It was found in a cave called Vogelherd in southern Germany, carved from the wing bone of a vulture with 5 precisely placed finger holes, and it is approximately 40,000 years old. When a replica was made and played by a musician who knows how flutes work, it produced sounds that were recognizable immediately as music, sounds with pitch and melody, and the specific quality of expression that flutes have always had, a sound that bypasses the intellectual processing of language and goes directly to feeling. 40,000 years old, and it sounds like music. But the first 100,000 years of human life extend 2.5 times further back than that flute, and the flute did not come from nowhere. The knowledge of how to make a flute from bone, the understanding of the relationship between the position of holes and the pitch of the note produced, the cultural context that made the investment of significant skill and time in making a musical instrument a worthwhile thing to do, none of these were invented for the first time when that specific bird bone was picked up and worked and perforated. They came from a tradition of sound-making that had been developing for much longer, for time spans that we cannot directly access because the instruments made before the ones that survived to be found were made from materials that did not survive. Wood and plant fiber and skin and other organic substances that dissolved without trace in the soils of the Pleistocene. The songs of the first 100,000 years are gone with a completeness that has no parallel in any other category of human cultural loss. Songs exist only in the moment of their performance. They leave no physical trace, not a molecule, not a mark on any surface unless they are recorded by a technology that did not exist until recently, or transcribed in a notation system that was not invented until thousands of years after the songs in question were being sung. The specific melodies, the specific rhythms, the specific vocal techniques, the specific ways that different communities organize sound into meaning and emotion across the first 90,000 years of modern human musical life. All of this is gone, absolutely. Not partly, not fragmentarily. The songs are as completely absent from the available record as it is possible for anything to be. And yet, we know they were there, with a certainty that does not require physical evidence, because the capacity for music, the neural systems that produce and respond to musical sound, are universal in our species and ancient in our lineage, present in every human population ever studied and appearing to be a feature of the basic architecture of the human brain, rather than a cultural overlay that some populations develop and others do not. We make music, all of us, always. It is one of the things that distinguishes us most reliably from other species, one of the things we do that seems to be genuinely, specifically, inalienably human, in a way that is difficult to account for on purely utilitarian grounds. We make music because we are human, and because we are human, the people of the first 100,000 years made music. Every night, around fires whose light is also gone, in languages whose words are also gone, and the songs were real, and the feelings they produced were real, and the people who sang them and heard them were as moved as you are moved when music does what music does, when it reaches past the defenses of the intellect and lands directly in the place that does not have adequate words for what it feels. The first 100,000 years of human life left almost no physical record. The materials of those years dissolved, the voices fell silent, the languages vanished, the ceremonies ended without witnesses who could write them down. But the first 100,000 years left something that physical material could never have preserved as completely or as faithfully. They left their mark in the biological architecture of your body, in the specific features of your psychology and your physiology and your neurology that were shaped by those years, and that you carry forward into every circumstance of your life, usually without knowing it, usually without any sense that what you are experiencing has a history going back to a world utterly unlike the one you inhabit. Your fear responses were tuned in the first 100,000 years, not abstractly, not generically, but in specific and identifiable ways that reflect the specific threats of the specific environments those people inhabited. The startle response, the way your entire attention is involuntarily captured by a sudden movement or a sudden sound, was calibrated in conditions where such stimuli frequently indicated predator activity, where the correct response to ambiguity was immediate high alert rather than measured assessment. The specific fears that many people experience in darkness or in small enclosed spaces, or at heights, or in the presence of certain animals, these are not random anxieties or irrational phobias. They are the calibrated responses of a nervous system tuned by thousands of generations of experience in environments where these specific conditions were genuinely and frequently dangerous. The world has changed. The calibration has not. Your social instincts were shaped in the first 100,000 years. The specific qualities of discomfort that social rejection produces, the way being excluded from a group or criticized by people whose opinion matters to you, can feel like a physical threat. This response reflects the reality of life in small hunter-gatherer communities, where social acceptance was not merely pleasant, but genuinely critical to survival. A person excluded from the community in the world of the first 100,000 years was a person without the safety net of reciprocal cooperation, without access to the collective knowledge and collective labor that made survival possible, without protection against the predators and the cold and the hunger that could kill a solitary person in conditions that a community could survive. Social belonging was survival, and the weight of social exclusion that the nervous system assigns to even minor social slights reflects a world where the stakes of social exclusion were that high. Your love of fire and of gathering and of the specific quality of warmth and light and safety that a fire produces when shared with people you trust, this is not a preference shaped by recent cultural history. It is a response encoded by hundreds of thousands of years of human social life organized around the communal fire, a response that activates systems of safety and belonging and social connection whose roots are in the most ancient layers of the human experience. When you feel at peace around a fire with people you love, you are feeling what human beings have been feeling in that specific configuration since before Homo sapiens existed. The feeling is ancient. It is the most direct connection to the first 100,000 years that most of us will ever experience. We return at the end of this long journey through the first 100,000 years to the silence, the vast, encompassing, almost total silence of the physical record for those years, broken only by the occasional fragment that managed to survive the long dissolution of time and materiality. The silence is real, and it would be dishonest to pretend that it conceals a record as rich and as dense as any subsequent period of human history. The silence is genuinely informative about certain things, about the scale and nature of what was lost, about the specific difficulties of preservation in the conditions of the Pleistocene, about the demographic instability that repeatedly disrupted cultural continuity. But the silence is also profoundly not emptiness. It is the silence of wood in acidic soil, the silence of songs in the air, the silence of knowledge held in minds that did not survive, the silence of the color of clothing that was perfectly real when it was worn and is now perfectly gone. The silence of the specific voice of a specific person saying something true and important to someone they loved beside a fire that burned in a darkness we cannot see into, in a language we cannot hear, in a night we cannot visit, 80,000 years before the first word was written anywhere on earth. The correct response to this silence is neither to dismiss the first 100,000 years as cognitively limited and historically irrelevant, nor to romanticize it as a lost golden age that modernity has corrupted beyond recovery. The correct response is something more difficult and more honest. To hold the genuine uncertainty with the genuine evidence, to let the fragments speak as fully as they can while acknowledging that they speak for almost nothing of what was there, and to feel, really feel, the specific quality of loss that is the loss of almost an entire people's story, because they left their hands. You know this image. The hand pressed against the stone, the pigment blown around it, the outline left in red or black or yellow against the rock surface that survived where everything else dissolved. Wherever modern humans went in those first 100,000 years and after, wherever the conditions for preservation existed, they left their hands. On cave walls in South Africa and France and Spain and Indonesia and Australia. Each outline is a specific, unrepeatable mark of a specific, unrepeatable person. This hand, this moment, this act of pressing one's physical self against the permanence of the material world and saying in the most fundamental possible language, below the level of any specific words, below the level of any specific cultural meaning. I was here. I existed. The world met me and I met it back. I was real. We found the hands. We are standing in front of them. We are shining our lights on outlines that have been waiting in darkness for tens of thousands of years, and the waiting was worth it, because here we are. The prayer of the handprint has been answered. The person is not invisible. Tonight, in whatever darkness you are lying in, you are the answer to that prayer. The most recent person to receive a message sent from the silence of the first 100,000 years, by someone who had no way of knowing whether the message would ever arrive. It arrived. You received it. Sleep well. Something changes in you after you have spent real time with the first 100,000 years of human life. Not dramatically. Not in any way you would necessarily notice from the outside, but something quiet and persistent settles in, a shift in the depth of your perspective, a sense that the story of humanity is vastly older and vastly richer and vastly more full of real human experience than anything you were taught in school, and that the part of the story that shaped you most fundamentally, the part that built the architecture of your emotions and your fears and your loves and your hungers, is the part that left almost no trace, the part that is most silent and most irretrievably lost. The people of those first 100,000 years were not our forerunners in the sense of being simpler versions of us on the way to becoming real humans. They were us, fully, completely, in every way that matters. They were us. They had the same brains we have. They asked the same questions we ask. They loved the same ways we love, and grieved the same ways we grieve, and lay awake in the dark wondering about the same things we wonder about. They pressed their hands against cold stone so that something of them would remain, and the specific reason they did that is the same reason we feel the specific ache of wanting to matter, of wanting to leave a mark, of wanting to be known by someone somewhere who cannot otherwise know us. That ache is 100,000 years old. It is one of the oldest things about us. The fragments that survived are not evidence of poverty in those lives. They are evidence against all odds of a richness that physical dissolution almost entirely erased. The ochre engraved with geometric patterns, the shells perforated for wearing, the body placed with care in the earth with things it might need wherever it was going. Each one of these arrived here from an almost impossible distance to tell us something we need to know. The silence is not emptiness. The missing years were full. The people who lived them were as real and as deep and as human as anyone who has lived since, and their story matters even if we can only see the edges of it. If this conversation has given you something, if the first 100,000 years of human life feel a little less absent and a little more present after spending this time in their company, then please subscribe. Not just because the channel needs subscribers, though it always does, but because there is genuinely so much more to tell. New discoveries happen every year. Ancient genomes are being sequenced from fragments of bone no larger than your thumbnail, yielding information about human migration and population history that keeps rewriting what we thought we knew. New sites are being excavated, and new findings are pushing back the dates of human symbolic behavior into earlier and earlier periods, filling in some of the silence with evidence of complexity and creativity that was there all along, waiting to be found. The story is not finished. It is still being told. Leave a comment wherever you are watching this from and tell me what time it is and what you are lying in the dark thinking about. I read all of them, and there is something genuinely moving to me about knowing that people in many different places and many different darknesses are spending their quiet hours with these questions, these fragments, these long-lost people pressing their hands against the stone of deep time and asking to be remembered. Because that is exactly what this is. You remembering them. You receiving a message that was sent from the silence of the first 100,000 years, and that somehow, impossibly, made it all the way here. The first 100,000 years are not over. They are inside you. They are in the circuits of your nervous system, tuned by a world you will never see, in the specific weights your emotions place on the specific things they care most about, in the way fire feels like home, and darkness feels like something is listening, and the face of someone you love feels like the safest thing in the world. Those responses are ancient. They were shaped in the first 100,000 years, in fires we cannot see and voices we cannot hear, and they are yours now, the latest expression of the longest story ever told. The silence was not empty. Sleep well wherever you are, knowing that you come from deeper than you thought, and that the depth is yours. There is a geography to the forgetting of the first 100,000 years, a map of what survives and what does not, that is shaped not just by time, but by the specific physical conditions of specific places on Earth. To understand why some traces made it through and most did not, you have to understand the geology and chemistry of preservation, because the story of what we can know about those years is in large part the story of where rock and soil and climate happened to cooperate with the biology of human habitation in ways that were vanishingly rare. Stone survives almost everything. Buried in the right sediment, protected from the chemical processes of dissolution, stone can persist for millions of years in forms that a geologist or an archaeologist can recognize and date and interpret. This is why the technological history of the first 100,000 years is the history of stone tools, not because those people used stone tools exclusively, but because stone is what made it through. The bone and wood and plant fiber and leather and everything else that constituted the vast majority of the material culture of those years, the houses and the clothing and the bags and the baskets and the nets and the boats and all the complex infrastructure of daily life, is gone, because none of those materials survive in the conditions in which most people lived. The exceptions are instructive. In extremely cold conditions, organic materials can be preserved for tens of thousands of years. The frozen mammoths of Siberia, preserved in permafrost, retain their hair and their skin and their stomach contents, giving us a window into the ecology of a world that existed tens of thousands of years ago. In extremely dry conditions, as in parts of Egypt and Peru and other arid regions, organic materials can similarly survive indefinitely, which is why we have the linen bandages of Egyptian mummies and the woven textiles of ancient Peruvian cultures and other organic artifacts from those specific environments. In waterlogged anaerobic sediments, organic materials can be preserved by the absence of the oxygen that enables aerobic decomposition. which is why ancient wooden objects and leather garments and even human bodies have been found in peat bogs in northern Europe. But most of the world is not frozen tundra, not extreme desert, not waterlogged bog. Most of the world is temperate or tropical soil, with the temperature and moisture and oxygen availability that allows decomposition to proceed with remarkable efficiency. Africa, where modern humans spent most of the first 100,000 years of their existence, has some of the most chemically aggressive soils on Earth, soils that can dissolve bone and carbonize wood and leave nothing but dust where a human community lived for a generation. The preservation conditions in most of Africa for most of the first 100,000 years were approximately as bad as preservation conditions could be, and the resulting archaeological record is approximately as sparse as it could be, not because nothing was there, but because almost nothing that was there survived. The sites we do have from Africa in the first 100,000 years are almost all in exceptional preservation contexts. Coastal caves where the chemistry of marine sediment created unusually favorable conditions, high-altitude sites where lower temperatures slowed decomposition, sites near specific geological formations where the chemistry of the local rock interacted with the sediment in preserving ways. These sites are not representative samples of where and how people lived. They are accidents of geology, places where the specific combination of factors required for preservation happened to occur. Everything else, the ordinary campsites and the ordinary settlements and the ordinary lives lived in ordinary places, is gone. This is the geography of forgetting. It is a map of exceptions of the places where the chemistry of preservation cooperated with the fact of human habitation in ways that allowed something to survive. The map is tiny compared to the territory of human life across those years. And understanding how tiny the map is, how exceptional the preserved sites are relative to the total lived experience they represent, is essential to understanding what the silence of the first 100,000 years means. It does not mean that nothing was happening. It means that almost everything that was happening happened in places and in materials that the chemistry of the Earth erased without a trace. Among the most significant and most consequential archaeological losses of the first 100,000 years is the evidence of coastal habitation, and specifically the evidence of the communities that lived along the shorelines of the world during the periods when sea levels were dramatically lower than they are today. This evidence is not merely sparse or fragmentary. It is for the most part gone entirely, submerged under meters of ocean that rose as the great ice sheets melted at the end of the Pleistocene, covering the archaeological sites of coastal communities that may have been among the most sophisticated and most densely populated human settlements of the first 100,000 years. The relationship between coastal environments and human populations is not incidental. Coastlines produce extraordinary concentrations of food: shellfish, fish of dozens of species, marine mammals, seabirds and their eggs, the plants of coastal wetlands and estuaries, the resources of adjacent forests and grasslands that often reach their most productive expression at the edge of the sea. For a hunter-gatherer people, a coastline is one of the most abundant and most reliable food environments on Earth, capable of supporting population densities that interior environments cannot match, and providing the caloric surplus that frees time and energy for the development of cultural complexity. Wherever modern humans had access to productive coastlines, they almost certainly occupied them, and the communities that lived on those coastlines may have been at the leading edge of cultural and technological development for exactly this reason. The same reason that river valleys and productive coastlines have been the sites of early civilization in the historical period. The sea level at the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago, was roughly 120 meters lower than it is today. The sea level during the early part of the first 100,000 years, when the climate was also substantially cooler and more ice was locked in continental glaciers, was similarly lower than the present. This means that the coastlines where the most productive and potentially most sophisticated human communities may have lived during those years are now under ocean water, in many cases under more than 100 meters of water. They are not merely difficult to excavate. They are essentially inaccessible with current technology, hidden under depths of ocean that make underwater archaeology essentially impossible at the scales and the resolutions required to detect and study Paleolithic-era habitation sites. The implications are significant. If the most sophisticated human communities of the first 100,000 years were coastal communities, and if those communities are now under the ocean, then the archaeological record we have access to is systematically biased toward the less complex and less densely inhabited interior communities that happen to have left traces in environments we can access. The very communities most likely to have developed complex symbolic culture and sophisticated technology, precisely because their subsistence base supported the population density and the surplus time required for that development, are the communities we are least likely to ever find evidence of. The silence of the first 100,000 years is not only the silence of perishable materials, it is also the silence of the ocean, swallowing a century of human achievement at the most productive margins of the ancient world. There are hints of what might be there. Marine sediment cores from regions of submerged coastlines sometimes contain evidence of human activity: charcoal from fires, pollen profiles consistent with landscape modification. Occasional underwater surveys in shallow coastal areas have found the remnants of ancient settlements, drowned forests, and other indicators of human presence in areas that were once dry land. But these are glimpses, tantalizing and incomplete, of an archaeological record that is almost entirely beyond our reach. The coastal people of the first 100,000 years are among the most thoroughly lost of all the lost people of those years, and the loss may be proportional to their significance. There is one form of evidence about the first 100,000 years that is not preserved in sediment or stone, not encoded in DNA or in material artifacts, but that has nevertheless survived with remarkable fidelity across enormous spans of time. It is encoded in stories. In the specific stories that specific cultures tell about specific patterns in the night sky, stories that in some cases appear to preserve information that can only have originated tens of thousands of years ago, before the populations that tell those stories separated from each other, before the human occupation of the territories where the stories are now told. The night sky is the same sky that the people of the first 100,000 years watched from their fires. The same stars appear in the same patterns tonight that appeared to the people who pressed their hands against cave walls in South Africa 90,000 years ago, and to the people who buried their dead in Israel 100,000 years ago. The precession of the equinoxes, the slow rotation of the Earth's axis relative to the background of stars, changes which stars are visible in which seasons and where on the horizon they rise and set. But this change proceeds slowly enough that the constellations recognizable today were essentially recognizable, with some adjustment, for the entire first 100,000 years of human history. People watched those stars. They tracked them and named them and told stories about them, because the sky is the most constant and most reliable feature of the environment, the one whose patterns are the same wherever you are and whatever season it is, the one whose cycles are perfectly regular in ways that the irregularities of the terrestrial environment are not. The rising and setting of particular stars marks the passage of seasons with a precision that no other natural phenomenon provides. The phases of the moon mark the passage of time within the year. The positions of bright stars provide reliable navigation in a world without maps. The night sky was the original calendar, the original compass, the original framework for understanding the regularity of time. And people have been using it that way since long before the first 100,000 years of modern human history. Some researchers have argued in work that is controversial but seriously discussed that certain features of widely shared sky mythology may preserve information originating in the period before the dispersal of modern humans from Africa, or shortly thereafter, information old enough to have been carried to Australia and the Americas and retained in cultural traditions that have preserved it across 50 or 60 or 70,000 years of independent development. The Pleiades, a small cluster of stars visible in the northern and southern hemispheres, are associated in cultures as widely separated as Aboriginal Australia and ancient Greece and the indigenous peoples of North and South America, with images of a group of female figures, sisters or women, and with the regulation of seasonal calendars. The similarity is striking enough to suggest possible common origin, a sky story old enough to have been carried to Australia by the first modern humans to arrive there 50,000 years ago, and retained in the oral traditions of the people who built their cultures on that continent. This is speculative. The methodology of recovering information this old from current mythological traditions is genuinely difficult, and the interpretations are contested. But the possibility it raises is profound. If some oral traditions have preserved accurate information about the sky, about the seasons, about the natural world for 50,000 years or more, then the first 100,000 years are not entirely silent. They speak in the myths we have received, and in the astronomical traditions we still practice, and in the names we give to constellations that were named, in some cases, by people whose languages are gone, and whose societies have dissolved, and whose daily lives are completely invisible to us. The night sky is the oldest book in human history, and it has been read every night for 100,000 years. The first 100,000 years of human life contained multitudes. Not just the ancestors of the people alive today, not just the populations whose genetic legacy survived to contribute to modern human diversity, but other populations, entire branches of the human tree that grew and flourished for thousands of years, and then were pruned by the catastrophes of the Pleistocene before they could contribute descendants to the modern world. These are the truly lost people of the first 100,000 years, the ones who left no genetic legacy in any living population, whose existence we know only because they sometimes left artifacts or bones in the rare conditions where such things survive, or because their genetic signal appears faintly in ancient DNA samples that have not yet degraded beyond recovery. Ancient DNA research has in the last decade begun to reveal the existence of human populations that were previously unknown and that left no living descendants, or left descendants only in populations that were themselves later absorbed or replaced. Genetic analyses of ancient remains from different regions of the world have identified ancestry components that do not fit neatly into any current population, and that represent populations that no longer exist in their original form. Some of these ghost populations contributed genetically to modern humans through interbreeding events before they themselves disappeared, leaving their traces not in any living community that recognizes them as ancestors, but in the diffuse genetic background of populations that absorbed them. Others appear to have left no genetic legacy in any surviving population, and are known only through the artifacts they left in the rare sites where preservation allowed their physical traces to survive for tens of thousands of years. Each of these lost populations was a people. Each had a language. Each had a culture, each had accumulated knowledge of their specific environment through generations of careful observation and tested practice. Each had ceremonies that marked the transitions of life and the passages of the year. Each told stories around fires that burned in the nights of the first 100,000 years. Stories whose specific content and even whose general character we will never know, in languages for which we have not a single word. They existed. They mattered. Their lives were as real and as significant as any life in the historical period, as any life in the 10% of human history that we can actually access. And they are gone with a completeness that physical death alone cannot achieve. Gone not just personally, but entirely. Their physical traces almost entirely dissolved, and their cultural inheritance unrecovered by any living tradition. This is the deepest loss of the first 100,000 years. Not the loss of information about people whose descendants survive, and whose cultural traditions persist in some modified form. The loss of people who left no descendants, who bequeathed nothing to the living except the fact of their having been here, which we are only now, through the most painstaking and difficult methods of ancient genetics and archaeology, beginning to partially recover. They pressed their hands against the stone, too, somewhere in the years of the Pleistocene, in languages and rituals and beliefs that are completely gone. And the stone that bore those handprints, if any of them survived, is lying under meters of soil somewhere that no one has yet excavated, waiting for a discovery that may never come. The first 100,000 years of human life present us, finally, with a question. Not a comfortable question, not one that can be answered quickly, or that resolves neatly into a conclusion that lets you move on. A question that stays with you, that changes the shape of how you think about yourself and your history, and what it means to be the species that you are. The question is this: if the people of the first 100,000 years were as cognitively sophisticated as us, as emotionally complex as us, as culturally developed and spiritually alive and philosophically engaged as us, then what does it mean that their story is almost entirely missing from the account we have of human history? What does it mean that we have built our entire understanding of where we came from and what we are on the 10% of human experience that happened to be recorded and preserved, while ignoring the 90% that was equally real, equally rich, equally significant, and equally constitutive of what human beings are? It means, for one thing, that we are systematically misunderstanding ourselves. We think we know the human story because we know 10,000 years of it. But the human story is 100,000 years old, and the 90,000 years we do not know were the years in which the most fundamental features of human psychology were shaped, in which the neural architecture that generates our emotions and our social instincts and our fears and our loves was calibrated against the specific conditions of the Pleistocene world. We are Pleistocene beings living in a Holocene world, and the mismatch between the world we were built for and the world we inhabit is the source of many of the most pervasive difficulties of modern human life. We did not evolve for sedentary office work or for social media or for urban anonymity or for the specific quality of constant low-level stress that modern industrial civilization produces. We evolved for something very different in conditions we mostly cannot access anymore, over a timescale that dwarfs the entire span of civilization. And we cannot understand ourselves properly without understanding that. It means also that we have been practicing a form of historical amnesia so complete and so habitual that we mistake it for accurate memory. We call 10,000 years of recorded history the human story, and forget the 90,000 years before it, because those years left almost nothing we can read. But forgetting is not the same as the thing forgotten never having mattered. The first 100,000 years mattered enormously. The people who lived them were real. Their experiences were real. Their knowledge was real. Their love for their children and their grief at their losses and their wonder at the night sky and their specific, irreducible presence in the world were real. And the fact that almost all of it dissolved into silence does not make it less real. It makes the loss of it more painful, more important, more worth acknowledging. There is a handprint on a cave wall somewhere in the world, pressed there in the first 100,000 years of human life, in total darkness, by firelight, by someone whose name we will never know, whose language we will never hear, whose specific beliefs and specific relationships and specific place in a specific community are completely beyond our recovery. The hand that pressed against that stone is not less real because we do not know whose hand it was. The act of pressing it is not less significant because we cannot explain its specific meaning. The life it represents is not less full because the fullness of it dissolved into silence long before any living person was born. It was real. It was here. And tonight, in whatever darkness you are lying in, somewhere on the other side of that 100,000 years, you are the latest person to know that it was real, and the knowing matters, and the silence that surrounds it is not emptiness, but presence. The presence of all those years and all those lives and all that richness pressing through the stone of deep time to reach you, however faintly, on this particular night. Let me end where every human night ends, in the dark, in the specific quality of quiet that descends when the day is finished and the body is ready and the mind begins its slow drift toward the country of sleep. Because this is the one experience in all of human history that is perfectly, completely universal. Every person who has ever lived has known this moment, the day releasing, the body surrendering, the particular vulnerability and particular peace of letting the waking world go. The people of the first 100,000 years knew this moment, not as an abstraction, not as a category of experience, but specifically and physically, in their specific bodies, in their specific places, at the end of their specific days. A woman in sub-Saharan Africa 90,000 years ago, lying down in whatever shelter her community had made, with the sound of the fire dying and the breathing of the people near her, slow and steady in the dark. A man on the coast of what is now South Africa 80,000 years ago, settling into sleep with the smell of salt water and the sound of the sea. A person somewhere in the interior of Asia 60,000 years ago, at the beginning of the Great Expansion, listening to a night that was full of unfamiliar sounds in a landscape they were still learning, on the edge of a world they were entering for the first time. All of them knew this moment. All of them surrendered to it, in the way that all humans in all times surrender to sleep, the same ancient biological necessity overcoming the same reluctance to let go of the day's grip, the same slow fading of the world's weight as consciousness softens into rest. The specific conditions were different, the specific sounds were different, the specific fears and specific comforts and specific people breathing nearby were different. But the moment itself, the moment of release at the end of the day, was the same. It is the same tonight, wherever you are in whatever darkness you have arranged around you, settling in for whatever measure of rest is available to you. You are connected to those people not by any abstract historical relationship, but by this. By the specific experience of this specific moment, reproduced across 100,000 years of nights, in conditions ranging from the comfort of abundance to the terror of danger and everything between. By the fact that the biological necessity of sleep is so fundamental to what you are, that it has not changed at all across the entire span of modern human existence, that the same process of neurological shutdown and physiological restoration that is happening in your body right now was happening in every human body that ever existed, in the people who painted the cave walls and pressed their hands against the stone and buried their dead with ochre and made music from bird bones and looked up at the night sky and asked the questions you are still asking. They are here in this moment, not metaphorically, in the biological reality of what sleep is and what it requires and what it does to and for the organism that practices it. In the ancient circuits of your nervous system that were tuned in the first 100,000 years and that are running right now, managing the transition from the waking world to the sleeping one. In the specific weight of the darkness and the specific quality of the quiet and the specific loosening of the day's grip that you are feeling right now, as you have been feeling it every night of your life, as every person who ever lived has felt it every night of theirs. The first 100,000 years are not missing. They are here in the dark, in the silence, in the oldest human experience there is. You carry them with you every night into the country of sleep, into the ancient biological renewal that has sustained the species across every catastrophe and every silence and every dissolution of every other form of record. The people of those years are in your body. Their experiences shape the circuits that are running you now. Their nights are your night. Sleep well. The silence is full of them. The history of ancient human behavior is a field that changes faster than almost any other area of historical research, driven by the relentless accumulation of new archaeological findings and the revolutionary capabilities of ancient DNA analysis that have transformed our understanding of human prehistory in the last 2 decades. Many of the specific findings discussed in this script represent the current state of research at the time of writing, but the picture is incomplete and actively developing, and the specific dates and interpretations will continue to be refined as new evidence emerges. What is not likely to change is the fundamental picture of the first 100,000 years as a period of genuine human cognitive modernity, of fully developed symbolic behavior and social complexity, whose traces are almost entirely lost to the specific conditions of preservation in Pleistocene Africa and beyond. The silence of those years is real, and the people who lived in that silence were real, and the gap between how they are usually represented and what the evidence actually suggests about them is significant and worth taking seriously. If this conversation has made you curious about the specific evidence, the sites most worth knowing about include Blombos Cave in South Africa, Pinnacle Point in South Africa, Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, the Denisova Cave in Siberia, and the cave art sites of Sulawesi in Indonesia, in addition to the more familiar cave art of France and Spain. The work of researchers like Curtis Marian on South African Middle Stone Age behavior, Svante Pääbo on ancient DNA and archaic human interbreeding, and the ongoing discoveries from sites across Africa and Southeast Asia that are systematically changing our understanding of when behavioral modernity emerged, these are worth following. The first 100,000 years are not yet fully recovered. They are still being found. We have talked about what the first 100,000 years built into the human body, into the circuits of the nervous system, and the calibration of the fear response and the social instincts. But there is a specific aspect of this inheritance that deserves more careful attention, because it is something that shows up in every person alive today, and that most people have experienced in ways they cannot quite explain, something that seems to come from further back than personal history and further back than cultural conditioning. It is the specific quality of fear that the dark produces. Not ordinary darkness, Not the mild inconvenience of a room with the lights off that you know perfectly well and could navigate easily. The specific kind of darkness that is also deep quiet and also unfamiliar. The darkness of being outside at night in a place you do not know well, or the darkness that descends suddenly and unexpectedly in a familiar place in ways that make it momentarily unfamiliar. The kind of darkness that produces not inconvenience, but a specific quality of alertness, a readiness that bypasses conscious thought and goes straight to the body, a subtle but unmistakable quickening of something that does not have an adequate name in the vocabulary of modern life, because modern life rarely requires a name for it. That response was tuned in the first 100,000 years. It was tuned in the tens of thousands of years before that, in the long evolutionary history of the hominin lineage, in millions of years of small primates and their ancestors learning that night was the time when the categories of predator and prey became most fluid and most consequential. But it was refined and maintained through the first 100,000 years of modern human life, in every night that every person spent in the open air of the Pleistocene world, in every moment of uncertainty about what was in the darkness outside the firelight. And it is fully present in you tonight, responding to stimuli that activated it in your ancestors with the same immediacy and the same physiological specificity that it activated in them. This is not a metaphor. The amygdala, the structure in your brain most centrally involved in the rapid assessment of potential threat and the generation of the fear response, does not distinguish between a threat that actually exists and a threat that your pattern recognition systems have flagged as potentially existing based on incomplete information. It responds to the pattern, not to the verified fact. And the patterns it is calibrated to respond to are patterns that were relevant in the first 100,000 years, not necessarily patterns that are relevant now. The sound of something moving in the darkness outside the range of the fire, the sudden silence of the animals that would otherwise be making noise, the smell that does not fit the expected smell of the environment. These are patterns that meant something real in the first 100,000 years, and the response they generate in your nervous system is the same response they generated then. The dark of the first 100,000 years was genuinely populated with dangers that required this response. Cave lions were real. Leopards that hunted at night were real. The darkness outside the firelight was a space of genuine uncertainty about what was present and what was about to happen. And the human nervous system, facing this uncertainty every night for tens of thousands of years, calibrated its responses to the worst-case interpretation of ambiguous nighttime stimuli, because the cost of a false positive, of responding to a threat that was not there, was the energy expenditure of a brief alert state and perhaps an interrupted night's sleep, while the cost of a false negative, of not responding to a threat that was actually there, was frequently death. The asymmetry of consequences shaped the calibration. Your nighttime vigilance was built in the first 100,000 years by exactly this logic. When you lie in the dark tonight and feel the specific quality of alertness that certain kinds of darkness produce, you are experiencing the inheritance of 100,000 years of nights exactly like this one, differing in almost every specific detail but identical in the fundamental structure of the experience, the animal body surrendering to necessary rest, while some part of the neural architecture maintains its watch, the ancient trade-off between the vulnerability of sleep and the necessity of it, the specific quality of peace that comes when the darkness is familiar and the sounds are known, and the people nearby are trusted. That peace is ancient. It was hard-won across thousands of generations in conditions where its absence meant danger and its presence meant safety. Tonight, It means the same thing it has always meant, in ways your body knows, without being told. We have spent a great deal of time in this conversation on the cognitive and technological and cultural achievements of the first 100,000 years, on what those people knew and what they built and what they believed. But there is something that should be said more directly about the emotional life of those years, about the specific weight and specific reality of the feelings that the people of those years carried. Because the emotional life is in some ways the most clearly continuous aspect of human experience across all the distances of time and culture, and because it is the most directly accessible to us through our own experience. They loved their children. This is the most fundamental and most certain thing we can say about the emotional life of the first 100,000 years, and it deserves to be said without qualification or hedging. The people of those years loved their children with the specific, fierce, embodied love that parents feel for children, the love that reorganizes every hierarchy of importance in a person's life, the love that makes a small, vulnerable, entirely dependent being feel more precious and more significant than anything else in the world, the love that expands the territory of fear by adding a whole new category of things that can go wrong. Evolutionary theory predicts it, and biological evidence confirms it, and the archaeological evidence of care for children, even in the most difficult circumstances, even in conditions of genuine scarcity, demonstrates it. They loved their children, and children in the first 100,000 years were extraordinarily vulnerable. The mortality rate for children in hunter-gatherer societies without modern medicine was high, and in the conditions of the Pleistocene, with its periodic episodes of climatic stress and its continuous exposure to diseases for which there were no antibiotics and no vaccines, it was higher still. Parents in the first 100,000 years lost children in ways and at rates that most people in modern societies are fortunate enough never to have to face. They lost them to illness and to injury, and to the ordinary statistical brutality of a world without the medical infrastructure that we now take entirely for granted. And they grieved those losses with the same specific, devastating quality of grief that the loss of a child produces in parents today. The grief that is different from every other grief in its specific weight, and its specific resistance to consolation, and its specific capacity to reorganize a person's entire sense of the meaning of things. They loved each other. The specific pair bonds that humans form, the attachment between adults who have committed to each other and built a life together, the love that grows deeper with time and shared experience and mutual dependence, the grief that follows the loss of a long companion, was as fully present in the first 100,000 years as it is in any human life lived today. It was not more efficient or less complicated or more rational than it is now. It was as specific and as unreasonable and as transformative of everything else in a person's experience as love always is. And the loss of those specific loves to the inevitable mortality of human life was grieved in the first 100,000 years with the same quality of loss that makes grief what it is, the sense that the world has been permanently diminished in ways that nothing can compensate for, that the specific person who is gone cannot be replaced by any other person, no matter how good they are, that the particular configuration of feeling and memory and habit and presence that a long love creates is unique, and its loss is permanent. They loved their friends. The specific quality of friendship, of the relationships formed between people of roughly equal status in a shared social world, who choose each other for reasons of mutual recognition and mutual pleasure in each other's company. Relationships that are not the obligations of kinship or the necessities of survival partnerships, but the freely chosen connections of people who simply enjoy being together. This too was present in the first 100,000 years. The specific pleasure of a person whose company you genuinely like, who makes you laugh in the specific way that only certain people can make you laugh, who sees things the way you see them or sees them in ways that surprise and interest you, who you want to tell things to because their response will matter to you. This pleasure is not a product of civilization or of written culture or of any of the specific conditions of the historical period. It is a feature of human social life that was present from the beginning, and the first 100,000 years were full of it. They were afraid of death. This is perhaps the most specifically and characteristically human of the emotions, the one whose presence most clearly marks the boundary between the human kind of consciousness and all other kinds. The awareness of one's own mortality, the knowledge that the specific self that is doing the experiencing will not always be there to do the experiencing, the specific quality of dread that this knowledge can produce, and the specific quality of meaning-seeking that it motivates. This was fully present in the people of the first 100,000 years, as fully present as in any person who has ever lived and thought about the fact of their own death, and tried to make sense of what it means. The burials tell us this. The care and the deliberateness of the burials, the objects placed with the dead for whatever need or journey or transition the survivors believed awaited them, the ochre applied to the bones in gestures whose specific meaning we cannot recover, but whose general quality of ritual care and ritual significance is unmistakable. These are the physical traces of a relationship to death that is specifically and characteristically human, the relationship of a being that knows it will die and cannot fully accept that knowledge, and keeps trying to do something about it, keeps trying to create a framework that makes the fact of mortality bearable, keeps reaching across the boundary between life and death. With whatever gesture is available, a handful of ochre, a piece of animal bone, the careful positioning of a body in the earth. The people of the first 100,000 years were afraid of death, and they did not pretend otherwise, and they tried, as all humans try, to find ways of holding that fear that allowed them to keep living well in the face of it. Some of what they tried is detectable in the burials, and in the ochre, and in the shells placed with the dead. Most of it is gone, held in the specific stories and the specific ceremonies and the specific beliefs of communities whose every trace has dissolved. But the trying was real, and the fear was real, and the love that made the fear of death feel like the specific fear it is, the fear of the loss of specific people and specific relationships, and the specific quality of aliveness that only this specific person has. That love was real too. There is a technology that was developed in the first 100,000 years of human life that was arguably more important to the survival and the success of our species than any other technology, a technology so fundamental that its complete absence from the archaeological record for those years represents one of the greatest distortions in our understanding of those years. And yet, its absence is guaranteed by the nature of what it was made from. The technology is clothing, and the absence of evidence for clothing from the first 100,000 years is not evidence of absence of clothing. It is evidence of how completely organic materials dissolve. Human beings are the only large mammal on Earth that does not maintain a coat of fur adequate to its environmental needs. We are naked in a way that no other primate is naked, a nakedness that reflects millions of years of evolutionary adaptation to a specific kind of thermoregulatory strategy, the sweating while running strategy that allows pursuit predators like our ancestors to overheat large game by running them down across the African savanna in the midday heat. That strategy required losing the fur that would have made sweating inefficient as a cooling mechanism, and losing the fur created a new problem. vulnerability to cold. The solution was clothing. Clothing is the technology that made every human expansion out of Africa possible. The colonization of high-altitude environments, of temperate forests, of the subarctic steppe tundra of glacial Europe and Asia, of the Arctic environments of Siberia and eventually North America. None of these were possible without clothing sophisticated enough to maintain body temperature in conditions that would kill a naked human in hours. The people who moved north out of Africa during the first 100,000 years, the people who climbed to high altitudes, the people who survived the glacial maximum in the refugia of southern Europe and the steppes of Central Asia, all of them were wearing clothing. Complex, layered, well-fitted, finely crafted clothing sewn with needles and thread, assembled from multiple materials with specific properties assigned to specific layers and specific parts of the body. We know this not because we have found their clothing, which is entirely gone, but because we have found the tools used to make it. Needles. The bone needles of the Paleolithic are among the most impressive small tools in the archaeological record. Thin, carefully formed, with eyes precisely bored through the narrow end. Objects that required extraordinary skill to make, and that had only one purpose: threading and drawing thread through material in the making of sewn garments. The oldest bone needles found to date are approximately 50,000 years old, from sites in Siberia. But the technology of sewing certainly goes back further, and the tools that precede needles, the scrapers and burins used to prepare animal hides for use as clothing, are present in the archaeological record much earlier, indicating that the production of hide clothing was occurring long before the needle made it possible to sew those hides into fitted garments. The full sophistication of Paleolithic clothing will probably never be fully known to us. The specific styles, the specific color choices, the specific symbolic significance of particular designs or materials or ways of wearing garments, all of this is as completely gone as the songs and the languages and the ceremonies. But the functional sophistication required to survive in the environments those people survived in is not in doubt. The clothing that allowed a person to survive a Pleistocene winter in what is now Ukraine, or to cross the mountain passes of Central Asia, or to live through the glacial maximum in an Ice Age refuge of southern France, was not a crude wrap of untreated hide. It was engineered in the original sense of that word, designed with understanding of its functional requirements, and crafted to meet them with the materials available. It was a technology as sophisticated and as important to survival as any stone tool, and it is entirely gone. Of all the technological achievements of the first 100,000 years, none is more remarkable and none leaves so little archaeological trace as the development of watercraft. The colonization of Australia 50,000 years ago required boats. This is not an inference or a hypothesis. It is a straightforward deduction from the geography. There is no way to get to Australia from Southeast Asia, even at the lowest sea levels of the glacial maximum, without crossing open ocean, and crossing open ocean requires some form of watercraft capable of carrying multiple people for multiple days. The watercraft existed. Almost nothing of them survives. Wood rots. The bamboo and reed and hide and bark that might have been the primary materials of the first watercraft rotted with even greater dispatch. The only traces we might hope to find of the earliest human watercraft would be indirect evidence, the remains of the materials used in their construction found in archaeological contexts, or the residues of waterproofing materials applied to the hull, or the wear patterns on tools used in their construction. These are extremely difficult to identify and interpret even when they are found, and in most cases, they are not found at all. What we can say from the fact of the colonization of Australia and from the subsequent colonization of numerous Pacific islands during the same general period, is that the people of those years had solved the problem of ocean navigation at a level of sophistication that allowed reliable, directional crossing of substantial bodies of open water. Not drifting, not being carried by currents to accidental destinations. Deliberate navigation, with some means of maintaining direction across days of open ocean when no land was visible in any direction. This required an understanding of the night sky as a navigational tool. It required an understanding of ocean swells and wind patterns as indicators of direction. It required the kind of boat capable of sailing or paddling against a current rather than simply drifting with it. All of this technology existed in the first 100,000 years, in the hands and minds of people who left almost no physical record of it. The boats of the first 100,000 years are among the most tantalizing of all the lost technologies of that era, not because they are unusual in having dissolved without trace, but because they represent an achievement so extraordinary and so clearly documented by its consequences. The people who built them, who tested them on coastal waters, and then in increasingly ambitious open water crossings, who developed the navigational knowledge required to use them for deliberate directional travel, who taught their children how to build and sail them across generations of accumulated maritime expertise, were solving one of the hardest engineering problems their world presented. And they solved it so thoroughly that their solutions allowed them to reach Australia and the Pacific Islands, and, eventually, every habitable coastline of the world. The solutions are gone. The consequences of the solutions are sitting in every indigenous population of the maritime world. The biological evidence that the boats worked and the navigation worked and the people who made them and used them were extraordinary. Every human culture we have ever documented believes in something beyond what can be directly observed, not in the same specific thing. The specific content of religious and spiritual belief varies enormously across human cultures, and the specific beings and narratives and practices that different cultures have organized their spiritual lives around are so diverse that it can seem as though religion is not a universal at all, but simply a collection of unrelated cultural traditions that happen to involve some common vocabulary. But the underlying structure, the relationship to something beyond the immediately observable, the belief that existence has dimensions not fully captured by the visible and the practical, the sense that certain places and certain times and certain acts have a significance that exceeds their material properties. This structure is universal. It appears in every documented human culture, in forms ranging from the most complex organized religion to the most stripped-down shamanic practice of the smallest and most mobile hunter-gatherer band. This universality is not accidental. The cognitive tendencies that generate religious and spiritual experience are not cultural add-ons to an otherwise secular human nature, optional features that some cultures develop and others do not. They are features of the basic architecture of the human mind, tendencies toward the perception of intentional agency in ambiguous phenomena, toward the attribution of meaning to patterns, toward the sense that the visible world is embedded in a larger context of significance that is not fully visible, that emerge consistently from the specific way that the human brain is organized, and from the specific way that human consciousness operates in a world whose full reality exceeds what can be directly perceived. These tendencies were present in the people of the first 100,000 years. The burials demonstrate it. The ochre demonstrates it. The systematic return to specific sites over generations, in ways that cannot be explained by purely practical considerations, demonstrates it. And the specific form that spiritual experience takes when these cognitive tendencies operate in the context of a hunter-gatherer existence in intimate contact with the natural world, with deep practical knowledge of specific animals and specific plants and specific landscapes, is likely to have been very different from the organized religions of the historical period, but not less real and not less significant to the people who lived in it. The sacred places of the first 100,000 years are mostly inaccessible to us. Some of them may be the cave sites where art was made, suggesting that the underground and the dark and the specific sensory conditions of deep caves had ritual significance for those communities. Some of them are likely the topographic features of the landscape that appear to have been significant in the oral traditions of hunter-gatherer peoples everywhere. Specific mountains and specific rivers and specific rock formations and specific trees that were understood as charged with significance, as places where the relationship between the ordinary world and whatever lay beyond it was somehow thinner or more accessible than elsewhere. These significances were held in stories and in rituals, and in the specific practices of communities whose relationship to their specific landscapes was intimate and long-standing, and organized around a framework of meaning that extended beyond the purely practical. Those stories and those rituals and those frameworks of meaning are almost entirely gone. What survives is the ochre and the burials and the rare cave paintings and the suggestion in the patterns of human behavior at certain sites that something more than the practical was operating. And what survives in us in the deep grammar of our emotional and cognitive life is the hunger for the sacred, the specific human need for a relationship to something beyond what can be immediately and practically known. The sense that the visible world is not all there is, and that the something beyond it matters and deserves acknowledgement and attention. That hunger was built in the first 100,000 years. It has not diminished in the 10,000 years of recorded history that followed. It is fully present tonight, in whatever form it takes in your specific life, in whatever relationship you have to whatever you understand as lying beyond the immediate and the practical. There is an ethical dimension to the first 100,000 years that does not often come up in the discussions of prehistory, a dimension that I think is worth making explicit because it changes the character of the conversation from a historical investigation into something with more immediate moral weight. What do we owe to the people whose story is missing? What do we owe to the 90,000 years of fully human life that left almost no trace in the record, and that has therefore been, for most of the history of modern scholarship, effectively ignored? The answer is not obvious. We cannot restore what was lost. We cannot recover the languages or the songs or the ceremonies or the specific shape of the knowledge that dissolved in the soils of the Pleistocene. We cannot name the specific people who pressed their hands against cave walls or buried their dead with ochre or built the boats that crossed the first ocean. The loss is permanent, and no amount of scholarly attention or ethical intention can undo it. But there is still something we can do, something that matters, even if it cannot undo the loss. We can acknowledge the loss as a loss, not as a historical curiosity or as a minor gap in an otherwise complete record, but as the loss of 90% of the human story. A loss of genuine magnitude and genuine moral significance. The people of the first 100,000 years were not proto-humans or pre-human forerunners. They were people as fully human as any person who has lived since, and their lives and their loves and their knowledge and their art and their beliefs deserve to be remembered and are not, through no fault of theirs, simply because the materials of their world dissolved before anyone thought to write things down. That is a loss that deserves acknowledgement. We can resist the temptation to fill the silence with condescension. The silence of the first 100,000 years is consistently misread as evidence of cognitive simplicity, as evidence that nothing interesting or important was happening, as justification for treating those years as a mere biological prelude to the real human story. This reading is wrong, and it is worth actively resisting it whenever it appears, because it distorts our understanding of what we are and where we came from, and because it is disrespectful in a specific and avoidable way to people who deserved better. We can take the fragments seriously. Every piece of ochre engraved with geometric patterns, every shell bead perforated for wearing, every carefully positioned burial, every hint in the archaeological record of a symbolic life being lived in conditions that preserved almost nothing, deserves to be taken seriously as evidence of real human complexity rather than explained away as accidental or anomalous. The fragments are few. They deserve all the attention they can receive. And we can carry the knowledge of those years with us, not as historical information stored in memory and occasionally retrieved, but as something that actively changes how we understand ourselves and our present. The first 100,000 years are not over. They are inside every person alive, in the ancient circuits of the nervous system and the deep grammar of the emotional life, and the specific needs and fears and loves that were shaped in conditions very different from the ones we now inhabit. Understanding this changes the relationship to yourself. It adds depth to the experience of your own life, the sense that what you feel and what you fear and what you love has a history going back much further than your own personal history or your cultural history or the recorded history of your civilization. It grounds you in something older and deeper and more fundamental than any of those things. And that grounding, I think, is worth something. It is worth the time spent in the company of the silence, listening for what it has to say. Sleep itself is a window into the first 100,000 years, a nightly passage into biological processes so ancient and so fundamental that they connect you to every human being who ever lived more directly and more physically than any cultural or historical connection can. Sleep is not rest in the simple sense, not the body simply pausing until the next day begins. It is an active, elaborately orchestrated process of restoration and consolidation. One that happens in the same fundamental way in every human body that has ever existed, following the same sequence of stages and the same internal logic of biological necessity that it followed in the people who pressed their hands against cave walls and buried their dead with ochre and made music from bird bones 40,000 years ago. The memory consolidation that happens during sleep is particularly striking in this context. During the deep stages of sleep, the brain systematically processes the experiences of the waking day, strengthening the memories of significant events, discarding the memories of insignificant ones, integrating new learning with existing knowledge, and transferring information from the temporary storage of working memory into the longer-term storage of established knowledge. This process is ancient. It was operating in exactly the same way in the people of the first 100,000 years, consolidating the specific experiences and the specific learning of their specific days into the accumulated body of knowledge that made them competent navigators of their specific worlds. What they were consolidating in their sleep was the knowledge of the first 100,000 years, the ecological knowledge and the social knowledge and the navigational knowledge and the technical knowledge that allowed them to survive and to live well in conditions that would kill an unprepared person within days. The memory consolidation of their sleep was building the accumulated expertise of Pleistocene survival, layer by layer, night by night, in the same biological process that is building whatever you are learning and consolidating tonight. Whatever knowledge and whatever skill, the experiences of your day have added to the ongoing project of your expertise. The dreams that accompany sleep are similarly ancient, similarly shared across the entire span of human history. Every human being who has ever lived has dreamed. The content of dreams varies, shaped by the specific experiences and specific concerns of the specific person dreaming, but the process is universal, and the specific quality of dream experience, the way it is immediately vivid and immediately plausible, and then, upon waking, strange and slippery and difficult to hold. This quality is the same in every dreaming mind that has ever existed. The people of the first 100,000 years dreamed. Their dreams were populated by the specific animals and the specific landscapes and the specific people of their specific worlds, but the experience of dreaming, the specific phenomenology of the dream state, was identical to yours. There is something in this that I find genuinely moving. In sleep, in the specific biological reality of what sleep is and what it does, you are most directly connected to the full span of human history, not through any cultural tradition or any historical awareness, but through the immediate, physical, nightly reality of shared biological process. Every person who ever lived has done what you are doing tonight, or preparing to do, surrendering to the ancient biological necessity of sleep in the specific way that human bodies surrender to it, following the same sequence of stages and the same biological logic, dreaming the same kind of dreams in the same kind of sleep that has followed the same kind of day across the entire first 100,000 years and all the years since. There is a specific figure in the first 100,000 years whose significance has been systematically underestimated in the standard accounts of human prehistory. A figure whose role in the survival and the cultural continuity of those years was so central and so important that the entire shape of the first 100,000 years of human life is incomprehensible without her. She is the grandmother. The older woman who has passed the years of childbearing and is therefore free, in evolutionary terms, from the direct demands of her own reproductive investment, and whose attention and energy and accumulated knowledge are available instead for the support of her adult children and their children. The grandmother. The unusual pattern of human female longevity, the way women routinely survive into decades of life, well beyond the end of their reproductive capacity in a way that no other primate does, is something that evolutionary biology has been trying to explain for decades. The most compelling explanation, the grandmother hypothesis, proposes that post-reproductive women in hunter-gatherer societies provided such substantial benefits to the survival of their grandchildren through foraging contributions and direct care, and the transmission of accumulated knowledge, that natural selection favored extended post-reproductive longevity in human females. The grandmothers who lived longer, who were more healthy and more capable of contributing to the survival of their grandchildren, had more descendants, and over generations the pattern of extended post-reproductive longevity became established as a feature of human female biology. If this hypothesis is correct and the evidence for it is substantial, then grandmothers were not peripheral figures in the first 100,000 years. They were central to the entire project of human survival and cultural continuity. Their accumulated knowledge, the decades of ecological and social and practical experience that they brought to the communities they were part of, was the deepest library those communities had access to. In a world without writing, in a world where all knowledge was held in human memory and transmitted through human speech, the oldest members of the community were the most valuable repositories of the knowledge that the community depended on. And the oldest women, the grandmothers who survived into their 60s and 70s, and sometimes beyond, were the living archives of everything those communities knew. They are almost entirely invisible in the archaeological record. There are no monuments to them. There are no records of their specific contributions. The knowledge they carried and transmitted has dissolved as completely as everything else from those years. But the fact of their importance is encoded in the biology of every woman alive today, in the specific pattern of human female longevity that makes no evolutionary sense except in the context of the grandmother's role, in the way that human grandmothers across all documented cultures provide care and knowledge and support for their grandchildren, in ways that are genuinely unusual in the animal kingdom, and that appear to be a fundamental feature of how human communities work. The grandmothers of the first 100,000 years kept the knowledge alive across the catastrophes. When the volcanic winters came, when the populations crashed, when communities were disrupted and their accumulated knowledge was threatened, the grandmothers were the people most likely to be carrying the deepest and most comprehensive bodies of knowledge. The people most likely to be the last link in the chain of transmission if the chain was about to break. They were the living embodiment of the cultural continuity of those years, the people most responsible for ensuring that the knowledge built over generations survived into the next generation and the next. Their absence from the historical record is not evidence of their insignificance. It is, like so much else about the first 100,000 years, simply the silence of a contribution that was made in materials that time could not preserve. Of all the images from the first 100,000 years that I return to most often, the one that sits with me most persistently and most specifically, that most fully represents to me the depth and the reality of the human life being lived in those years, is the image of a child learning. Not in a school, not from a book, not from any of the specific institutions and technologies of formal education that we associate with the transmission of knowledge in the historical period. A child learning in the ancient way, by watching and being shown and practicing and being corrected and trying again in the context of actual daily life, with the full weight of real consequences reminding them at every step that what they were learning mattered. The child who watched their parents skin an animal and understood, from careful observation over many repetitions, the specific way that the knife must be held and the specific direction of the stroke and the specific attention required to follow the line between skin and flesh without cutting one or tearing the other. The child who followed the older children and then the adults through the landscape, learning by decades of accumulation to read the signs that told you where water was and where game was likely to be, and where the specific plants ripened in the specific season, and what the specific cloud formation on the specific horizon meant for the weather of the next few hours. The child who sat at the edge of the firelit circle at night and heard the stories, the ones that seemed to be entertainment and were also instruction, that seemed to be about animals or ancestors or the beings of the spirit world, and were also about how to navigate the specific challenges of specific kinds of situations, how to behave towards strangers, how to manage conflict within the community, what the obligations of reciprocity required, and what happened when those obligations were violated. That child was being educated in the most effective way human beings have ever devised for transmitting complex, practical, contextual knowledge, by immersion in the actual practice of the knowledge, in the presence of people who possessed it fully and who cared deeply about passing it on. The education that hunter-gatherer children received in the first 100,000 years was not inferior to formal education in its outcomes. In many domains, it was superior. The ecological knowledge produced by a lifetime of guided apprenticeship in a specific landscape, beginning from early childhood and continuing through decades of increasingly independent practice, exceeded the ecological knowledge available to trained field biologists in many specific respects. The child learning in the dark of the first 100,000 years was being prepared for a world of extraordinary difficulty and genuine danger, And the preparation was thorough and effective, and given with genuine care by adults who understood that the quality of the preparation would determine the quality of the child's life, and possibly the continuation of the child's life itself. They were being loved and educated and prepared for the world in ways that were adapted to the specific world they would inhabit, by people whose investment in their success was as deep and as genuine as any investment in any child's success in any subsequent human culture. Those children grew up, and they became the adults who taught the next generation of children, and the chain of transmission continued, fragile and frequently broken and repeatedly rebuilt, across the entire first 100,000 years. The specific knowledge changed as the environments changed, and as populations moved, and as the encounters with other groups and other ways of doing things altered the cultural toolkit available. But the fundamental structure of how knowledge was transmitted, the child watching and being shown and practicing and being corrected and eventually mastering and eventually teaching, this structure was constant, and it was as effective as any educational technology that has been developed since. At the very end of this conversation about the first 100,000 years of human life, I want to return to the fire, not as a symbol or a metaphor, but as a literal, physical reality. A fire burning in a specific place, in a specific night, in a specific year of the first 100,000 years, tended by specific people whose names are gone, and whose faces we cannot imagine, and whose voices we will never hear. The fire is small, it is made of wood, and the wood was gathered before dark, and the fire was started with tools and techniques that represent accumulated knowledge of materials and friction and patience that goes back further than our species itself. It is giving warmth and light to the people gathered around it, and they are talking, or singing, or sitting in the specific companionable silence that is only possible among people who know each other well. That fire went out eventually. The wood burned down and the embers dimmed, and the specific circle of warmth and light collapsed back into the darkness and the cold of a Pleistocene night. That specific fire has been out for tens of thousands of years. But the fire was not the end of the story. The people who sat around it knew how to make fire again, and they made it, and the knowledge of how to make fire was transmitted from those people to their children, and from their children to their grandchildren, and so on, across the entire span of the first 100,000 years, and through every subsequent generation to the present. The specific fire went out. The knowledge of fire, the relationship of human beings to fire, the specific comfort and safety and social gathering that fire enables, this did not go out. It is burning tonight, in your home or in your city, in a form so different from that Pleistocene campfire that the connection between them seems almost fictional. But the connection is real. The knowledge was transmitted. The fire never went out. This is the story of the first 100,000 years. Not the story of a single continuous civilization that developed smoothly toward inevitable progress. The story of a flame that was repeatedly threatened and repeatedly maintained across catastrophes and near extinctions and the dissolution of almost every physical trace of the specific communities that tended it. But that was never entirely extinguished. The story of people who kept the flame alive through conditions that should have extinguished it, who transmitted what they knew to whoever would receive it, who pressed their hands against cold stone in total darkness and left the outline there for whoever came later, who buried their dead with care and with the specific objects that mattered, and with whatever hope or belief in something beyond the immediate darkness of death they carried. You are the latest recipient of that flame. Everything that was transmitted and maintained and rebuilt and transmitted again across 100,000 years of human nights. leads, in the end, to you, in your specific darkness, at your specific moment in the story. The people of the first 100,000 years could not have imagined you. They had no framework for imagining a world as different from theirs as the one you inhabit. But in the specific ways that matter most, you are continuous with them. You feel with their emotional architecture. You fear with their calibrated nervous system. You love with the same specific intensity and the same specific vulnerability that they loved with. You sleep with the same ancient biological necessity that they slept with. And tonight, as you let the day go and the world softens into rest, you are doing what they did every night of their lives, maintaining the continuity, keeping the flame alive for one more night, surviving into another day. The fire goes out every night. It is lit again every morning. The first 100,000 years are in the fire. They are in you. Sleep well. There is one more thing that needs to be said about the silence of the first 100,000 years. One more thing that the silence itself is telling us if we are willing to hear it. The silence is not only a record of loss, it is also a record of resilience. The fact that anything at all survived from those years, the fact that the shells and the ochre and the rare burials made it to us across tens of thousands of years of geological and chemical dissolution, tells us something important about the persistence of the human impulse to mark the world with evidence of one's own existence. People kept making things. They kept engraving patterns and stringing beads and placing objects with the dead, and returning to significant sites across the full span of those years, in conditions that were generally not favorable to preservation, and that in most cases destroyed every trace of what was made. The things that survived did so against enormous odds, and they survived precisely because the impulse that created them was so persistent and so powerful that it generated the same kinds of marking behaviors repeatedly, in enough different places and enough different conditions that some traces made it through. The silence is the record of the vast majority that was lost. But the fragments that made it through are the record of a persistence that survived every catastrophe, every population crash, every cultural disruption of the Pleistocene. People kept reaching for permanence in a world that offered almost none. The ochre was ground and applied. The shells were perforated and strung. The dead were placed carefully in the earth. The patterns were scratched into stone. Night after night, year after year, generation after generation, in conditions that erased almost everything, people kept trying to leave a mark. The marks that survived are not the whole story. They are the lucky fraction of an enormous effort to be remembered that was mostly defeated by time. But they are enough to know the effort was real, and to honor it, and to understand ourselves as the inheritors of that same impulse, still reaching for permanence in a world that will eventually dissolve us too, still pressing our hands against whatever stone is available, and leaving the outline there for whoever comes next. The first 100,000 years are in the silence. They are in the fragments. They are in you. Sleep well and know that you are not alone in the dark. You are surrounded by 100,000 years of people who slept in their own darknesses and woke to their own dawns and loved their own people and marked the world as best they could. They are the oldest company there is, and they are yours. Every night, for 100,000 years, someone has lain down in the dark and thought one last thought before sleep took them. We do not know what the last thoughts were of the people of the first 100,000 years. We do not know whether they were thoughts of fear or gratitude or love or worry or wonder, or the specific blankness of exhaustion that sometimes takes the place of thought entirely. We know only that those last waking moments happened, as they happen for you tonight, in whatever specific texture of feeling and attention is yours as the day recedes. But this we can say, whatever that last thought was, for any of the billions of people who have preceded you in the dark, it was the last thought of a fully human mind. A mind as complex and as conscious and as alive to its own experience as yours. A mind that, like yours, had spent the day navigating the specific demands and the specific beauty of the specific world it inhabited, and that was now, like yours, releasing the day's grip and preparing for the ancient renewal of sleep. The content of the last thought changes across 100,000 years. The quality of the mind having it does not. You are the latest version of that mind. You are the current expression of what began in the first 100,000 years and has been maintained across every generation since. The specific kind of awareness that the human brain produces, that finds the world meaningful and terrifying and beautiful and worth staying awake to understand, and that also, every night without exception, knows when to let go. Let go now. The first 100,000 years will be here when you wake.